So now I'm very excited to introduce somebody I have admired for a long time now and somebody I consider a friend. Toni Tipton-Martin is an award-winning food and nutrition journalist who is building a healthier community through her books, foundation, and in her role as editor-in-chief of Cook's Country magazine and its television show. Her books, which are fantastic, please buy them immediately, include the Jemima Code, Jubilee, and Juke Joints and Jazz Clubs and Juice. She's also the recipient of the Julia Child Foundation Award. She's a three-time James Beard Award winner, and she has earned the International Association of Culinary Professionals Trailblazer Award, its Book of the Year Award, and Member of the Year Award. One of her most recent projects, which I'm looking forward to talking about, is the new cookbook, When Southern Women Cook: History, Lore, and 300 Recipes from 70 Women Writers, which she shepherded with Cook's Country executive editor, Morgan Bowling. And we'll have the link to the book in the chat so you can learn more about it. And please purchase a copy, which I know you'll want to do after our conversation today. So, Toni, thank you so much for being here. Always a pleasure to see you and talk to you.
It's so great to be here. Thanks for having me as always.
Of course. I just want to dig right in, and I'm wondering if you can talk about the inspiration for When Southern Women Cook. Why this book? Why now?
Well, I love talking about this book. It's such a major accomplishment, and it brings together really both sides of my uh, career and my passions within the food world. Most people know that I have been in pursuit of telling fuller stories as it relates to African American food history and making sure that the contributions made by African Americans generally, but women in particular, are preserved, celebrated, and just honored that because those people contributed so much to our food systems and things that we don't typically think about as values and positive attributes for them. We think of them as laborers primarily.
Right.
And so I took the job at America's Test Kitchen because I saw that as an opportunity to expand this work to embrace even more communities, meaning the entire American food world, right? That
Hmm.
we could look into regions all across the country, meaning the cooks of the country, and find out whose stories had not been told.
Right.
Within a short amount of time, I developed a very close relationship with one of my editors, Morgan Bowling, who is also a cast member on our television show. And Morgan kept talking about her work at a women's shelter and her passion for women and the way that she wanted to bring food and women's self care together. And I suggested that she help them assemble a cookbook, right? And I'm thinking that I'm just helping her pursue her private ambitions.
Right.
And the more that we talked about it, the more I realized that I had had this history in the American South through my relationship and leadership at the Southern Foodways Alliance. And Southern is a very popular topic. And so why not put together a book that fulfilled both of our missions and visions? So that's how it came
Oh,
about.
that's so exciting. And I love that partnership and that creativity that you both contributed. It's so fascinating. What I really like about this book is that it's not just about recipes. There's history and essays and from the authors and the chefs. Why did you and Morgan think it was important to include those as well?
Well, what's interesting about the assemblage of this book is it does reflect both of our priorities and pursuits and our growing interest in each other's worlds. So,
Hmm.
what you find in the introduction is I give a really detailed explanation of what my experience and is within the South and the fact that I'm from Southern California, not the American South. But I have a passion for, as I said, the stories of women who have been marginalized and made invisible there. Morgan, so I write that in my part of the introduction. Morgan, in her introduction, gives the similar explanation for her interest in women, but she approaches things through the recipe development angle. So
Mm,
she talks to us quite a bit about the understand what our understanding of what it means to create recipes. And so when we blend my determination to identify the people behind recipes and her ambition to make sure that recipes are uh, written about in such a way that anyone can have success and feel confidence in the kitchen. Those two things come together really well. And we explain that in the intro. So we basically are knowledgeable in each other's worlds, but I am more strongly rooted in storytelling and history. She's more interested in recipes. That said, ATK and Cook's Country had a vast archive of Southern recipes. But as everyone knows, I don't think I will be disparaging in any way. America's Test Kitchen has not always focused on the people who
right.
were the creators of those recipes. And we know that in various points in time, people have perceived that as erasure, right? Or a
Hmm.
way of appropriating someone else's work. And I've been very careful to identify different thoughts about recipe development and the reality that there is no original recipe. We're always adapting and revising and refining a recipe. I think when it crosses over into appropriation is when someone else is making a living and money off of
Right.
your recipe and you haven't been given any credit or recognition for it. Um, and so I knew that we didn't have, as a staff, the capacity, right,
Mm,
to do the kind of deep dives and storytelling that I'm accustomed to.
yeah.
And so I reached into my binders of women and came out with a list of women that I had personally listened to over the years in my roles at SFA, at IACP, at Beard. Like there's
Hmm.
always been the thing that women do, right? We try to solution find perhaps outside of the system, right? And we did that in the hallways and in the ladies' room and on sofas in the lobby, right? And it wasn't crying in your soup necessarily, but
Right.
there just was never any resolution,
Yeah.
So this book for me is a step towards actionizing resolution.
I love that. I love that. You also, actionizing resolution is so powerful. You mentioned determination and ambition from both you and Morgan, and that's what, made this book and the recipes accessible and how, helps cooks like me who aren't that great have the confidence to really try things that they normally wouldn't. And that's so inspiring. And I love hearing about, identifying these recipe makers as creators. They were creators. They were creating something that was new and refreshing. And I know no recipe is new, but like to be able to revise and adapt that recipe takes so much creativity and sort of, I think, bravery on a lot of those creators' parts.
Absolutely. And what we were able to do then in the research process is discover how many women were behind iconic dishes and foods and ingredients and things that are essential to the American food system, not just in the South, but across the board. And um, that was part of what helped us distill down 300 recipes and 70
Right.
writers, right? Like it's already a big tome. Many people have jokingly said, "Oh, you can use it as a doorstop," or like, it's a really big and dense book. which was different than what ATK is right accustomed to. But what you see is a beautiful combination of the passion for finding unique stories that have not been told,
Yeah.
and matching those with recipes that make you want, they serve both, they serve each other. You read the story and you want to make the recipe, but if you're a cook, you come to this book interested in the recipe and you learn something about the person behind it. And that's what's so wonderful and unique about it, or unique for the ATK model. It's very consistent with Jubilee and Juke Joints for
Right.
sure. Um, but it goes another level deep in terms of really having the resources and the time to have people who are experts in their subject matter speak on these
Right.
topics. So in my books, I do a lot of research. I'm not from the South. I'm not, whatever. I'm not a bartender. Like, I'm not the things that I write about necessarily, but I am a good researcher. I'm an excellent journalist. So I know how to do
True.
that investigative work. I think you were the one who called me what did you call me one time?
A culinary
A culinary
detective, I think.
detective. It was so fun to hear you describe me that way. But what these 70 writers do is make that content, the history, approachable in the way that ATK has always made recipes
Yeah.
approachable. And so we didn't just go for the straight history story here. Um, and that means that we have a diversity of voices.
Yeah.
Um, we have certainly the straight reportage with journalists who are telling us about the history of biscuits or about white lily flour, and that sort of thing, and the story of the woman who's behind the red wax strip on the Maker's Mark bottle. I
Right.
love that story.
Me
Um,
too.
I love that story because it talks about the ways that women have used entrepreneurship for their self care. But we also have some more pensive essays, right? Shane Mitchell, who is an award winning writer from the Charleston area, writes about the history of rice growing in that region, but she's
Mm.
dealing with her own internal conflict over the real history of rice wealth and agriculture in the Carolina Low Country,
Yeah. Yeah.
and the fact that those enslaved Africans never were given credit for saving the American rice crop, right?
Hmm. Hmm.
Even though we have advertisements that show that enslavers were traveling to the rice coast of Africa, bringing back with intentionality people who could do that work.
Yeah.
So Shane takes a light but heavy approach to telling that story. We have poetry in this book. And maybe one of my favorite stories, it really captures the blending of all of these ways of telling a story. And it is the story of the Waffle House. And I have never been in a Waffle House, but I had heard all of these criticisms of male lyricists who write about or sing about getting all their women at the Waffle House.
Mm.
And I listened to some of it and called a Southern woman music writer and asked for a connection to someone who she thought could help unpack what's going on at the Waffle House,
Hmm.
right?
Hmm.
And that might seem like a lot of a story to tell in a recipe book,
I love it
but
though.
it was so fun. It turns out that she is the lyricist for Miranda Lambert, and she came back with this story about wearing a pink Chanel suit into the Waffle House and the women that you encounter there, and
Mm.
they should not be preyed upon, during their periods of emotional distress.
Sure.
Yeah, it's so there's a lot of there's
Fascinating.
fun in this book, but there's
Yeah.
also some really engaging reading there too.
There is engaging reading. I wonder if we can talk about, what happens to our understanding of culture and history when women's stories are forgotten in the way they have been in the past.
Oh, what a good question. Um, I think whenever we leave an essential group out of a conversation, you're only getting part of the story.
Yeah.
So that is not limited to women, and it has certainly been true of the African American contributions as well. It's easy to, just focus on the importance of food waste today or recycling
Hmm.
as important
Sure.
things to do environmentally. But when we think about women and the survival techniques, the pioneering strategies, um, just the practical ways that they ran a home, those are elements
Hmm.
that are not new concepts. And sometimes I think in modern day, we can get entangled in things being too complicated or too much trouble, or I don't have enough time. Like there's always these barriers
Hmm.
to entry to certain things. I don't have time to recycle. But your grandmother had a simple strategy. She had a can on the back of the stove, and when she finished cooking, she strained that oil into the can and she reused it. And
Right.
that is an expression of um, really good stewardship of the land, of our environment. But we've portrayed that as something that only poor people have to do,
Right. Right. Right.
right? And so when we misunderstand the contributions of any group, it's easy to dismiss them or maybe not even participate when they're repackaged, right? Because it can seem
Yes.
too off-putting for one way reason or another. So making sure that there is inclusivity isn't just good for the group that's having their dignity restored. It's
It
also
is.
group for the it's also good for the greater good.
Yeah, that inclusivity, the dignity, but it's also this opportunity to really celebrate these different voices, right? Or the voices that we haven't heard from. They're not different. We just haven't listened to them.
That is true. But I'm thinking about the political climate that we're in now, and I might have answered you differently
Sure.
before. So in some ways, I don't see that what we're going through is there are a lot of things that are different about it, of course, but like the concerns that people are having are concerns we've experienced before, and
Mm-hmm.
there are strategies, there is wisdom, there is information that survivors can share
Right.
um, with the rest of us. Um, and like as we're talking, let's just make it as simple as the price of eggs, right? Like
Hmm.
though
Hmm.
there are people who understood how to make eggs go further. You can
Right.
make a mock vinegar pies or various other depression era type foods. Um, but we all don't yet think we need that information.
Sure.
So those voices are being quieted again,
Mm,
and we're just going to have to reach a place where we realize we need each other and we have similar desires to provide for our families, to live independently, and to be healthy without feeling like one person's stability necessarily causes the instability for someone else. Uh,
absolutely.
that's where I think the struggle is right now. And food is a really good way to arrive at that Venn diagram.
Hmm.
I love talking about just, one of the greatest examples I've used in my private work is to talk about pie, the making of a pie. We all essentially, every culture in almost every part of the world, in cases of filling in a crust
Right.
of some kind. Everybody does it. And we held with another partner in Austin Texas, we held what we called pie socials. And they were held over the King holiday in expression of King's desire for the expansion of the beloved community.
Yeah.
And what we did was ask people to bring a pie that represented their community. And it did
Oh,
not matter whether it was sweet or savory. And at first, people really struggled, like,
mm,
especially in communities where they don't think they have a pie in the traditional sense.
sure.
But once we started talking about samosas and empanadas and dumplings and pasties, like you can go through and everybody could come to the party with something to
Yeah.
share. And then you have a place of commonality to start the conversation, right? You
Yeah.
don't have to go all the way in with the most controversial aspects of where we are. You can just start with food.
And that building community, I mean, that's where, whether one considers themselves political or not, we all I think I think we all recognize that community is what we need right now. We need to be sort of talking to one another in whether it's over food, I hope it is, but learning from one another, disagreeing with one another in a civil way. But like we've lost that. And I think that kind of, pie social is a way to bring that back. And it's such a beautiful sort of story, but we should all be doing that on our blocks and our neighborhoods and our cities and our, rural areas. That would be wonderful, Toni.
It was really an amazing thing to pursue. And we started out, we thought we were going to have a nonprofit associated with it. And then I took the job at ATK. And so my attention has been diverted from it. But the first one that was held by an artist teacher, an artist instructor, professor at UT. And she intentionally held it um, in the neighborhood that is just west of the university that
Hmm.
has been completely turned over and is gentrified, except for this Black church. So this was the
Mm,
place that freed Africans, Americans were um, required to live.
mm,
But it kept them in proximity to the wealth of the university and the neighboring area where people could get to work. And so this Black church is still there.
yeah.
And so Luann went to them and suggested this idea of a pie social, taking into account what social food socials used to do. We think about the
Mm,
ice cream social
right.
or the pie social. These are supposed to be light moments. And the idea, she even argued that cake was too scientific, right? It required even more barrier to participation because you had to know how to bake a cake.
Sure.
But literally, we gave permission for you to use refrigerated dough, canned fillings, like whatever it took. And I'll end with this, we even over the years had a contest where people could have their recipes judged for various reasons.
Nice.
And some kids won one year for taking a tortilla and spreading it with strawberry jam and topping it, I think, with fresh sliced strawberries. And they called it, their strawberry pie.
I love
I
that.
know, I know. It was just so amazing to see that this was penetrating children,
Hmm.
right? So food has an incredible way of bringing us together. And as you said, when we start to share, we can learn so much from each other. What did your mother do with that grease that was on the back of the stove? Like
Right.
my mother never strained it, right? Modern people, in terms of food waste, are talking about how you need to strain it and get all those granules out of it and all of that fond.
Isn't that where the
But in the
taste is and the
But
granules?
right in the old days, and I think because they were using it so much, it wasn't going to turn rancid. So I get
Right.
today we know so much more about food safety than those people did. But there's just some wonderful, wonderful stories to be told, not only about our self care and about the care of our environment, but at the care of our communities in these stories of women who um, uplift their communities through their work. And that includes women like the waiter carriers, who were African American women at the turn of the 20th century, who in a small town in Virginia called Gordonsville, um, made a living by frying chicken legs and serving coffee and lemonade to train passengers as they came through. And it created an opportunity for survival for
Right.
them. There are, in more modern times, we talk a lot about the Vietnamese communities and the
Oh, yeah.
impact that they've had on our communities in the Gulf in particular.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of stories for us to share. Um, and this book is our way of doing that.
It really is. And when you talk about, how some of these women had, created these opportunities to survive, those opportunities for survival have now turned into entrepreneurship opportunities, into businesses, into people following in their footsteps in so many ways.
That's true. We talk about the Latinas who are making a pastry that is common in their community called concha. And but there's a little political twist to what they do in the delivering of it. We talk about the idea of the pepperoni roll in West Virginia, right? And so it's not just fried chicken and biscuits in this book, even though there are, I think, 8 recipes for fried chicken, and lots of recipes for biscuits. But yeah, we cover entrepreneurship to ensure that women specifically, but people generally, again, I feel like I'm beating a dead horse, but
Yeah.
so that people understand all is not lost,
Right. Right. That's very
right?
important.
It's so easy to become hopeless in difficult times, whatever side of those difficult times you're on. Like we're all struggling for the high from the high price of eggs.
Sure.
Um, but um, if we learn how to take care of ourselves and our communities, maybe we can survive and come out on the other end with our mental health.
I hope that is true. I'm struggling,
Right,
to
we
be
all
honest.
are, but I'm reaching in. I'm actually writing now about these virtues. So I have explained the Jemima Code was somewhat heretical. If you think about
Mm.
when I
Mhm.
published that in 2015, the
Right.
internet was just getting started, and people were not accustomed to having this level of conversation about
Sure.
culture and race and erasure and stuff like that. I mean, we were still arguing over whether Aunt Jemima belonged on the package of the pancake mix and the syrup
Right.
bottle or not. And so I had to take a very careful approach to that research. And the reason I think you call me a culinary detective is because I explain I checked everywhere looking for evidence of these people and their contributions to American society. And it dawned on me one day to look in cookbooks.
Mm-hmm.
And when I realized that a cookbook had its own way of preserving community and freezing in time a place and its philosophies, whether we really understand that fully or not, you can tell what a group thought of itself by the ingredients that it chose,
Right. Right.
right? And what their accessibility was like by the ingredients that they chose, and what recipes they chose. So this was not just some arbitrary project where an African American woman decided to advocate on behalf of other African American women. I did not want to be perceived that way. I wanted these people to be respected on their own. I was the vessel, but I
Right.
realized that that was really a controversial thing to do in 20. I started this in 2008,
Yeah.
and it didn't come to fruition until 2015. So what we did was intentionally not include recipes in Jemima Code. It's just a book about books and a
Right.
way to start to level set. right? It's an
Yeah.
entry point, sort of like a pie social. It gives a place where everybody can come in. You
Hmm.
can read about these books and these authors and just be surprised. That's all you have to do
Right.
is be
Right.
surprised. And it wasn't until Jubilee and Juke Joints that I then started to look at those stories behind the books and the recipes to start to see if they told a story of their own. So in the organizing of Jubilee, which is a standard cookbook with the average the classic chapters from appetizers to desserts, I realized that there were broader pro- professional categories that were particularly invisible, and
Yeah.
uh, bartending and service was one of them. So the next book in the series became a cocktail book that did exactly what we're talking about with When Southern Women Cook, but it did it for the bar community. So I'm writing now about their virtues. I think the public is ready
Mm.
to to feel the love that I have felt. I've had to be restrained and very journalistic and
Sure.
objective, and depending on which of you interviews me, it depends on how deep I'll go.
Sure.
Right? I've been very careful
Yeah, I
because
know.
I've wanted to be heard.
Sure.
But I think the time is right for us to now see what was going on when those women were raising the children.
Hmm.
What were they talking about with those kids? And the mom wasn't there. She was, off at the country club with dad, or like whatever was going on. I'm starting to really listen for the life lessons that are in these stories that again we can share in our pie socials.
Yeah. Oh, that's so I mean, it hits me. It makes me want to cry and laugh and just be, excited all at the same time. But we do need more of that. And you are exactly the person to do it in so many ways because you have all of these books and all of this experience to build upon. I'm sorry, I'm getting emotional, Tony, but it's so exciting and cool. I need to
It's the time
um,
we're in. Listen, take a deep
yeah,
breath. It's the time that we're in. And I get
yeah,
that way. I get that way sometimes when I'm interviewed and I've had to uh, come up with a different answer for why I'm,
sure,
being
sure.
emotional because it's not always respected, right? But
Yeah,
what you're feeling, I guess what I want to circle back to is I want to go back to the Jemima Code for a second.
yeah,
When that book first came out, before it came out, and I did not have any evidence of what I was talking about,
sure.
but I was just trying to build a little interest. So I started speaking, I started taking images of those people around, started in Austin, and then, came to Houston and did a talk there.
Hmm.
Um, and we occupied spaces with the images of the people first.
Hmm.
And so I would open with a picture of a domestic cook, like somebody that had been in everybody's household. And my opening question was, what do you see when you look at her? I wish we had
Mm.
the cover of the book to throw up on the screen right now, because it's such a fun exercise. So if you
Right.
haven't ever seen it, Google the Jemima Code and then ask yourself that question.
Mm-hmm.
And because I won't have to give it away here, I never asked anyone to raise their hand and say what they were
Mm-hmm.
feeling, but what I did do was point out that every one of us was having a different reaction to that image. Everybody
Yeah.
was feeling something different, whether she was your auntie or your grandmother, or the woman who was in the kitchen when your family was in the living room,
Mm-hmm.
whether she was the woman that they had bring the cupcakes to your classroom birthday party. Like
Mm-hmm.
everybody had some perception of who she was. And what I said at the time was, we're all going to start there at the cover of the book with a different understanding. But
Right.
when we get to the end, we will all have the same perception that she was competent, loving, thoughtful, I'm looking up on the wall because the cover of the book is on the wall above my at my office. Um, that just again, that does not have to take away from another community. We don't have to
Right,
keep tearing people down in order to feel lifted up. We can just appreciate her for what she gave us.
right. Right, absolutely, absolutely. I want to continue on this theme of sort of politics, activism, because kitchens have been such a part of that, fueling the resistance in so many ways. Of course, during the civil rights movement, how can we translate that? You mentioned the pie socials. How are we, how can people like me, Toni, love food, want to, be more active politically now more than ever before, have been in the past. I used to say that my second job was protesting when I lived in DC. How can we use the power of food to not just resist, but again, bring people together?
That's such a wonderful question, and it continues the theme of a second ago when you were emotional, because when people are in that thought of evaluating the woman, the image of her, emotions come up first.
Right.
It could be angry, it could be heart wrenching, it can be pleasure, right? Because you have these
Hmm.
fond memories of her. And even within that, when you come together with another group of people and you share that emotion, you're aware, you have to become aware that when she was at your house and you were feeling really loving about her, she wasn't at home with me.
Right.
So let's not get entangled in fighting about whose way is best, what is the most superior. Like, those are all the words we're not going to use now going forward. We're going to be respectful and show empathy. And the kitchen allows us to do that.
Yeah.
Um, Meaning, so the end state of that is I can't tell people what to do in their individual communities because our communities are all different.
Right.
But what we can do is start with this idea that we want to use food and something common about it to open the door for conversation, whatever that conversation needs to be, depending on our group. So, I've done this. I did this, like I said, I was trying to decide how to come back into the food world before
Hmm.
ATK. And so my husband was like, you need to make this a diversity experiment exercise for corporations.
Mm,
So we tried that
mm,
and had little questions on the table, like talking points. What was your bread like in your community or whatever? And so empathy, knowing that we're coming into this as a space in a space with an ambition to understand other people. It's a very simple concept. Just and Stephen Covey talked about it in this way, and he said, "Seek first to understand." Was one
right.
of the seven habits, right? Um, or was that Franklin? Which one of them did it first? I don't remember, but it was a Coveyism to seek to understand first.
Right.
And that can just help us quiet a lot of the noise that's happening out there.
Sure. You mentioned the word empathy, which I think is so important in the times we're in. And I think your books help us understand that in different ways. Do you, when you finish a project like this one, what is the what is the feeling that you have? And how are you nervous? Are you excited? Do you worry that people won't get it?
Oh my goodness. Yes. First, as a writer, there's that exhilaration that you made it. You just want to put it down and not look at it again. And that is just real. Yeah, any writers in the audience need to be aware that there is a philosophy. Writers hate writing but love having written, and that is who we are. So that first inclination is to be thankful that you made it, but with a little bit of distance and time.
Hmm.
Um, yes, you can start to see the ways that this can be a change agent. And there is some fear always of being reviewed and criticized. When the Jemima Code, I go back to the Jemima Code because
Sure.
everything since then has been, people might think it was automatic, but it's just been building on top of success on top of like success. But there was a struggle moment. And when the
Right.
Jemima Code was first published, because I was presenting a contrary historical narrative, most of the food world did not want to talk about it.
Right.
The book was not reviewed; it was announced.
Sure.
So, right, the difference between a press release, that says this book is available,
Yeah.
is very different than someone really digging in and telling you what you're going to get here. I see a little bit of that here with
Mm.
When Southern Women Cook.
Mm.
It took one article, and I think it was Mother Jones, interestingly enough, that dug deep. And that almost gave permission to
Yeah.
everyone else, right? And so when this book started winning, when Jemima Code started winning awards, people knew I was up to this study, but they didn't quite know how I was going to deliver it. And today, this has become a model, and several other authors have begun publishing in this same style.
Right. Right.
I think that's really wonderful. I'm happy that it is encouraging people to seek the sources
Uh-huh.
behind foods that we love. But a podcaster said to me that he didn't know my work, and he was interviewing me for When Southern Women Cook, and he said, I have to tell you that I read one of those books, and I didn't feel what I feel when I'm talking to you.
Mm.
Not my books, one of the
Mm-hmm.
new
Mm-hmm.
interpretations of the style. He said it made me feel guilty.
Mm.
And we have to be aware that this conversation can challenge
Sure.
people. That's why empathy is so important, because everyone's not on the same page. And so when we start having these conversations, we can talk about how it's good for the environment and it's good for individuals. We can also talk about entrepreneurship. And as people are losing their jobs, what is in
Right.
their community? What can they do as a community to come together and create a business model? Like, is there
Right.
something what happened in the old days with bartering? There's just so many old school virtues
Right.
um,
Right.
that can come from these conversations. But I think, as you pointed out, they start with empathy and understanding everyone's not coming from where you are.
For real, for real. Your books evoke so much for me as a reader, and I know so many other people. I do want to leave time for a Q&A from the audience, but Toni, you have done things, as you said, sort of, you've been the trailblazer for this kind of writing in so many different ways. And I just want to thank you for that because it's so important to have books that, make us feel guilty, make us feel sad, make us feel confused, make us feel happy, make us feel energized, make us ready for the fight. And you've done all of that with your books.
But at the end of the day, we want you to soothe and salve your
Yeah,
sores with really delicious food, right?
exactly.
And that cannot be understated, right? Like, these are recipe books, not just as a tactic deployed to uh, lure people into a difficult conversation. And so, if I had any fear at all, as you were asking me, how are people going to receive it? That's what I worried about,
Mm,
was that, this would feel inauthentic or a contrivance or, something manipulative. Because people are emotional. And I have not spoken in the beginning. Black women were crying in the front row or they didn't come at all. Like,
right.
everybody had so much baggage around this subject of service to one another.
Yeah.
Um, so we've lost that. Like, what were those people really doing when they served you a drink across the bar? Just stop for a minute and take all the race and gender off of it and ask yourself, when you go into a bar and you sit there, what happens, right? And so I really appreciate what you said there, and thank you so much for that. It is going to be what gives me the encouragement to step out with my own emotions and the things that I've kept sort of hidden behind
Mm,
the journalistic veil. I have one last step that I'm going to uh, take before that memoir writing, and that is again to action, to put into action all of these words. And I think it's important to create, to spur the next generation.
absolutely.
Right. So this work does wonderful things for helping build community, but in my nonprofit work, the goal is to inspire and empower the next generation. Well, we do a lot of work. You do a lot of work with farming and agriculture, and even, some teaching people how to cook is happening. But we aren't teaching people how to preserve their histories and
Right.
to ensure that their identities are not lost. And so I'm partnering with part of my work for the Julia Child Foundation, and that grant that I received is to partner with um, organizations that have um, event planning opportunities
Mm-hmm.
that I just cannot deliver on my own.
Mm-hmm.
And we're going to hold the first Writers Symposium in Nashville in
Nice.
April. Yeah, it's very exciting. And I have provided 10 scholarships so that emerging writers or trained writers who want to learn more about how to teach themselves or teach people in their communities how to preserve their stories,
Wow.
we will discuss that. And so we've put together an incredible lineup of women through Les Dames d'Escoffier. Um, and so Ruth Reichel, my mentor and first real teacher, who was the editor of the New York Times, she was the restaurant editor for the New York Times and the editor in chief of Gourmet magazine. And we are going to open
I
with
love
this
it.
this conversation about the power of words.
Oh, the power of words. Toni Tipton-Martin, do you mind taking a few questions
Oh, I
from
would love
listeners?
to. I would love to. Thank you so much,
Folks
Dani.
can, oh, thank you. And we'll remind people where they can buy the book, Toni, while I look for people's raised hands. I don't have my
What we
glasses.
want you to do is support your local indie bookstores. They're all available there. When
Wonderful.
I do public speaking, it's at indie bookstores.
All right, let me see who has their hand raised. Deborah.
Okay, here I am. Um, Quick question. I teach people how to cook, and it's culinary history. What is the history, if any, between black and white women in the South that come from a sharecropping or agricultural background? Because it's a different type of cooking than that ends up in the big house and in the junior league cookbook.
Well, that's a really good question that has a really big answer. So I don't want to occupy too much of the time. What I want to do is just refer you back to the very beginnings of when America was colonized. And there have always been two lines of cooking. That is what my work is about. I am not talking about the agricultural South, or which is the um, backdrop for what we know of as soul food, meaning the food that was made in survival, the creative energy that people spent trying to make something from nothing. I do not disparage that, but we have plenty of conversation about that lane. What we don't talk about is the food that came from the big house. And when we do talk about the big house, we always attribute it to the aristocracy. We don't talk about the people that were trained in France or came from the Caribbean with elite cooking skills, classically trained people who were taught to cook with American ingredients and then went on to create catering and other businesses that occupy that more junior league lane. So what you read about in Jubilee and the Jemima Code are the people who were in that, I'm sorry to say, lane, right? They were the ones that had access to publishing. They were the ones who had proximity to get the white women in their community to help them get their recipes recorded.
Mm.
But the people that are the ancestors of the sharecroppers didn't have that. So there are two lanes. You're absolutely right, and they are I have taken responsibility, if you will, for telling the story of the Black people that were hidden in the aristocracy.
Thank you so much, Toni. Thank you, Deborah, for the question. Anyone else have their hand raised? If not, I have one final question for you, Toni. I mean, you're going to have this wonderful event in Nashville. Do you have any advice for, folks who are just getting into writing, young people who want to tell similar stories, who have this passion around food or agriculture? What's what's a piece of advice you can give everyone?
I really encourage people to know not only their own history and what they understand of it, but to understand the history of others. I could not have told the story of the plantation cooks without first understanding what the definition of a plantation cook is, no matter what the race or gender of that person
Hmm.
might be. And in this day and age, we have access to so much information online. Some of it is accurate, much of it isn't.
Right.
Um, so, what a journalist does, and a clue that I can give you, is to take what you learn from a generic source and then try to validate it in as
Mm.
many ways as possible. And the closer you can get to a single story, the closer you are to a fact. But as long as you're just reading these things in one place with one philosophy, you can pretty much guarantee there's another side to the story that's not being told.
Right.
So young or emerging or people in transition writers need to know that you need diversity of sources.
Love it. You do have to be that detective, don't you, Toni? You have to be a
Yes, you
detective
do.
and really dig
Yes, you
in.
do.
Oh, Toni Tipton-Martin, thank you for all that you do. Thank you for writing about these things. Thank you for being a friend to Food Tank. I encourage everyone to go out and buy When Southern Women Cook, History, Lore, and 300 Recipes from 70 Women Writers. Toni, you're a treasure. You're a national treasure. Thank you for everything.
You're so amazing. Thank you all for listening and for coming. I appreciate being here.